Greetings humans, and welcome to my world, where a couple months ago I explained how advocates for gender equality could improve their deconstructions of gender roles, and a key part of that was a feminist crash course on how we can actually help both women and men. But for many feminists, one question must first be answered. Should feminists help men in the first place? Which is answered up to 3 different ways by those who think we should not. Some say that feminism exists solely to advocate for the rights of women, while others will suggest that men don't need help to begin with, and others still will tell you that feminism is for everybody, but then seemingly do nothing except occasionally suggesting that men need to talk about their feelings more, only then to switch to a different answer if you suggest that's not enough. Usually, my instinct is to present people with evidence that proves how men are suffering too, but that alone rarely does the trick, because the question, should feminists help men, for them is not directly predicated on, are men suffering too? So in order to give the correct rebuttal, we must first understand the argument itself. So I'm going to play some clips of feminist Big Red on this topic, that I've edited for the sake of brevity, but if you want to get the full context of everything said, I've put links in the description below.
A lot of MRAs say that feminism doesn't fight for the rights of men. What would you say to that?
Crimea River. Feminism is a movement about the discrepancies, like when it comes to women's equality, because we're still not there yet. And so when we create a space, our own space, to talk about our own issues and the things that we have to deal with, these MRAs decide to go trample on our parade and say, but what about the men's? I'm sorry, you have been taking over our politics and our media for God knows when. So don't even start with that whole, but you don't think about the men's issue. Well, then you know what? Start your own goddamn movement.
So on the surface, Big Red is resolved that feminism exists solely to advocate for the rights of women, and so men's issues require a separate movement. But that's actually just one of several answers she provides, consciously or otherwise. Watch a little longer, and she says,
which they have, but maybe make it a little more about legitimate issues like custody and alimony and things that you think are unequal, which all stem from patriarchy, not from, oh my god, feminists are trying to take away our kids.
And now let's watch from 1 minute 3, where she was answering for whether or not feminism is still needed and relevant.
We're always trying to dismantle gender roles. At the end of the day, that's really all we want, is to really dismantle gender roles and make sure that, hey, you know what? If you are for example, in custody battles, if you're the better parent, we want you to have custody. That's it. I don't care what your genitalia is or your gender identity. It doesn't matter. If you're the better parent, you get custody. If you make more money, then you have to give out the alimony. That's it.
Did you notice how she not only listed off male issues, but also attributed them to patriarchy, which is exactly what she did during her most famous moment of activism? Additionally, when Big Red talked for a moment about gender roles and divorce proceedings, she actually sounded like someone trying to convince you that feminists actually help men too. Feminism is for everybody. So regardless of Big Red's apparent thought that feminism is a movement for women's equality, she also seems to recognise that oppressive male gender roles and men's issues are also rooted in patriarchy, and so even the activism she practices against patriarchy with an exclusive focus on women's liberation will actually affect and potentially even help men in their own struggle. So what does Big Red really think about addressing men's issues outside of feminism? Let's find out. In 2013, Big Red protested a men's rights event at the University of Toronto and cheered when one of her fellows pulled the fire alarm, forcing everybody to evacuate. Otherwise, Big Red spent that day either yelling at MRAs about women's issues, attributing men's issues to patriarchy, or telling MRAs around her to shut up so that she, the feminist, could speak over them.
It's part of patriarchy. Part of patriarchy. I don't know if you're noticing a theme. Patriarchy. Anyways, I'm not done. Not done. Shut the fuck up.
All of which indicates that she actually does think that feminists could and should address men's issues. If nothing else, it's rather a stark contrast from her complaining about MRAs raining on feminist parades to say, what about the men? And even the notion that she would tolerate a separate movement for men's issues. So what exactly are people who care about men supposed to do? We can't have our own movement, and we can't be part of yours. It'd be one thing if Big Red were alone on this, but in a lot of men's experience, she's really not. The years around 2013 did leave their scars in feminist spaces, and not without good reason. But now it's accepted that if you are not a feminist, then you are a sexist. Which on its own is a fine statement, but when you couple it with those scars flaring up anytime you, as a feminist, talk about men's issues, accusing you of misogyny and attempting to steal the spotlight from women, you leave men with no options at all, and to disastrous consequences. If we, as progressives, are to have a healthy and constructive conversation about men, then something has got to give, and that something hinges on the question, should feminists help men? If we can determine that they should, and feminism really is for everybody, then we can work to dismantle gender roles together, for everybody's sake. If, however, feminists should not help men, then we should at least consciously allow space for a healthy men's movement elsewhere. So let's address the excuses for feminism not helping men, the first of which begins with an optional argument.
Yeah, but what about men's rights? Men already have all the rights.
But even most feminists disagree with this, and it sets the bar where if men are suffering or lack necessary rights, then feminism should help men. For this reason, the argument that men already have everything that they need is actually presented to misdirect you, while they also argue something like this.
The reason that feminism is primarily concerned with sexism that women face, and not so much that men face, is because women are the minority or the oppressed group. For something to be considered oppression, it needs to have three components. It's in the national consciousness of the dominant culture, it's reinforced through the institutions of society, and there's an imbalance of economic, social, and political power.
This is highly effective, because the argument that men aren't suffering under patriarchy is outrageous to anyone who knows better, and so it captures your full attention, despite the fact that this second argument renders the first one completely irrelevant. Additionally, almost no two feminists really put it the same way. For example, Feminist Frequency simply describes the difference as being oppression plus power. Meanwhile, YouTuber Fawn Mead would say,
Before I even get into this, I just want to state that it's impossible for the oppressor to be the oppressed. That's the nature of oppression. Being offended by something is not the same as being oppressed by something. So bearing that in mind, quite simply, sexism is a form of oppression. I am not saying that men don't face negative stereotyping, and I am not saying that men don't face prejudice and oppression in society. However, only oppressed people experience all of that, as well as it being institutionalized and systemic.
I find that this academic word salad is such a common barrier to feminists having serious discussions about men that I can't really leave it unaddressed, which by design is going to take a long time. But before that, I should also point out the cruelty of this barrier in the first place, especially when these phrases aren't just used to exclude legitimate men's issues from feminist activism, but also to argue that sexism itself against men is impossible. How is that okay? Feminism is the gender equality movement and therefore carries immense privilege, government funding, recognition in the platform of academia, frequent platforms in the news, and even directly in the government itself. It is abhorrent that we so commonly shirk criticism by insisting that feminism also cares about and helps men, only then to mumble flimsy excuses not just for failing to help them, but also to actively absolve certain feminists and actions on our part that are actually sexist and hurt men even more. This is not just irresponsible, it's not even just heartless, it is actively cruel to a people that we know are suffering and in need of help, or else we wouldn't have constructed such an arbitrary barrier beyond just their suffering in the first place. That being said, I'm actually going to humour this argument and then bury it in the ground forever, by proving that men are, in fact, systemically, institutionally oppressed themselves. So let's start with the word oppressed, which rests upon the phrase, the oppressor cannot be the oppressed. I spoke at length about this in my previous video, so I'll condense my argument here. While the oppressed-oppressor dichotomy applies very usefully to discussions of white supremacy, it does not in fact describe gender roles as prescribed by patriarchy, because there are key differences between what patriarchy and white supremacy dictate and the effects thereof. When a conservative sexist talks about gender roles, they describe what they think is a partnership in which the men and women both play an equally important but opposite part. The woman keeps the home and cooks dinner, the man goes to work. The man is stoic and emotionless, so that he can brave his work, protect and provide for his family. The woman is emotional, so that she can soothe her husband and keep him strong. She nurtures the children and makes home a happier place. This is, of course, a lie that results in women being intellectually undermined for their perceived emotionality, and so they suffer when pursuing their careers, while men are empathetically undermined for their perceived lack of emotionality, and so it is believed that men cannot care for children or be raped or abused. When patriarchy has its way, everyone suffers, from what I call myoga, or mutual yet opposite gender repression. White supremacists defining white people against black people is radically different from myoga. White people build civilizations while black people chuck spears. White music is cultured and genius while black music is vulgar and primitive. White people are hardworking and compassionate while black people are lazy and criminal. Following white supremacy to its conclusion does not result in some intended partnership, however flawed as modern patriarchy does, because white supremacy describes which of the two parties have value, while patriarchy describes the means by which each party can have value. Patriarchy merely describes a fictitious marriage and prescribes cooperation, while white supremacy describes a master and their slave, and prescribes colonization and genocide. While it is true that even in a modern patriarchy, a slither of the male population holds the majority of capital and political power, those men don't actually use that power to make life better for their sex, because they themselves are subscribed to enforcing the same patriarchal gender roles which hurt everybody. It's no different to saying that black oppression is over because Barack Obama happened. They won't abolish MGM, they'll still see women as children's caregivers, they still won't fund male abuse shelters, and they still won't recognise forced envelopment as rape. The only thing that a slither of the male population will do is line their own pockets. Patriarchy in practice is not synonymous with male prosperity. It is merely the perpetuation of the same gender roles that hurt everybody, which I shouldn't need to tell you considering that intersectional feminist critiques of power feminism literally describe this same concept for women. For this reason, I don't think that the framing of the oppressor and the oppressed really works here, because everyone is oppressed by gender roles as they are. That being said, I've only proven that the word oppression is on the table, not that men are systemically oppressed. But what exactly does systemic or institutional oppression mean? I've seen conflicting definitions, so I wanted to defer to a more academic source where possible. Fortunately, Portland Community College have a publication on precisely this matter. Institutional oppression is the systematic mistreatment of a people within a social identity group, supported and enforced by the society and its institutions, solely based on the person's membership in the social identity group. Institutional oppression occurs when established laws, customs, and practices systematically reflect and produce inequities based on one's membership in a targeted social identity group. If oppressive consequences accrue to institutional laws, customs, or practices, the institution is oppressive, whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have oppressive intentions. So the bar is set. If I can prove that men are systemically oppressed, then men's issues will become feminist issues, at least to anybody who makes this argument. So let's be clear on the two terms. Number one, to constitute systemic or institutional oppression, it must be socially, institutionally, and legally enforced. Number two, what are institutions? Institutions are fairly stable social arrangements and practices through which collective actions are taken. Examples of institutions in the US include legal, educational, healthcare, social service, government, media, and criminal justice systems. So let's get cracking. I trust that most feminists won't disagree that toxic masculinity both exists and is reinforced, both socially and institutionally, by our families, our churches, and our fellows at school, by the media, and even our laws. Part of toxic masculinity is the dogma that men should be self-sufficient and without emotion. You don't admit defeat or ask for help. You power through and compete in all aspects of life, never taking handouts. You don't talk about feelings or cry when life gets hard. Instead, you must demonstrate that you are dominant and in control. Either make a show of how nothing phases you, or, in the right situation, intimidate, beat, and command your adversaries into submission. While one result of this role is to drive some men towards corporate power, the negative results are countless and pervade every aspect of society. The crime survey for England and Wales in the year ending March 2019 says 67% of all victims of domestic abuse were women, while 33%, or 1/3 of all victims, were men. Note that these are legal crime statistics. In spite of this, the UK government defers to Women's Aid on the matter of domestic abuse, who write reports about their 3,649 bed spaces for women and children, but only mention male victims once, exclusively for the purpose of dismissing them, a full third of all domestic abuse victims. But why would they do this? Why not talk about how many beds they have for men? Well, Mankind, a charity concerned specifically with domestic abuse suffered by men, not only writes in their briefing on refuges and safe houses for male victims of domestic abuse that men actually comprise 45% of all victims, but also write that there are only 19 organisations offering refuge or safe house provision to men in the UK, a total of 78 spaces. Of these, only 20 spaces are dedicated to males, 7 of which cannot accommodate men with children. As we're soon to learn, there's a reason why men survey higher for domestic abuse than they appear in crime statistics, but we'll be generous and run the maths as though it's just the crime statistics. Men are 1/3 of all domestic abuse victims. Despite this, men can access only 2.12% of all domestic abuse shelters at all, while women have access to 99.45%. Even by dividing this number by 2 to make it proportional to the rate at which men and women are victimized by domestic abuse, each woman still has 25 times more access to domestic abuse shelters than men. And this is just the UK. In all of Scotland, there are no spaces available to men whatsoever. So why the female bias? Well, my government defers the issue of domestic violence exclusively to women's organisations and provides them with funding, while charities like Mankind are funded by public donations. The government will even publish and set about a plan specifically to end violence against women and girls, but would never do the same for men. Men are supposed to be dominant and powerful, self-sufficient and without feeling. Such men cannot possibly be the victims of domestic abuse, and even if they were, it's not as though men have needs or feelings to hurt to begin with. For this reason, my government behaves as though these men do not exist, while the people, the police, and even the institutions intended to help them will treat these men as objects of suspicion and ridicule. A study titled Help Seeking by Male Victims of Domestic Violence and Abuse, a systematic review and qualitative evidence synthesis, looked across 12 studies spanning 11 years and found that men do not trust the services in place would be helpful or take them seriously. These services often present themselves as being for women, and so that is how they are perceived. Many suspected that they would be mistaken for the aggressor, and those who did engage with services described being treated precisely that way, an experience that I can personally vouch for. The study also supports what Mankind will tell you about the reasons why men don't leave abusive relationships, citing concern about the children in 89% of cases, and the fear of never seeing them again in 68% of cases. But why are men afraid of losing their children? Well, despite PR statements by law firms denying it, without ever providing data, mind you, the data that does exist shows what even Big Red will tell you, that family courts are biased towards women. The 2010 US Census Bureau shows that only 1 in 6 single parents with custody over children whose other parent lives elsewhere were men. While there are caveats to this which indicate more than a simple belief that women are inherently better caregivers than men, these caveats still lack justification and result in sexism. The Salt Lake City child custody attorney at the MEA Cordano Attorney at Law says, when judges choose by determining which parent is the primary caregiver, often not considering how each parent's schedule might change following the divorce, a father who works full-time while married may plan to work part-time if he were a single father. Moreover, these standards are often still applied when the child is above the age where they need 24-hour supervision. This is where the web begins, because men's issues are anything but the atomized side effects of patriarchy. Rather, they are the densely tangled systemic result of a societal blueprint based on gender roles that are oppressive of both men and women. The social role of men renders their abuse a non-issue, ignored by the government and mistreated by the very systems designed to help. Compound this with a family court system that is biased against them, and you exponentially increase the number of men who are terrified into staying put with their abusers. And this is only the beginning. A myth that somehow goes unquestioned, even by feminists, is that men don't suffer from rape or rape culture, but the data begs to differ. The charity RAINN says that 1 out of every 6 women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape, while for men it's 1 in 10, which on its own is disturbingly substantial, but actually looking into studies on the topic, the prevailing numbers showed that actually 1 in 6 men will be sexually assaulted by the age of 18, and that sexual assault of men is very likely to go underreported. This makes a lot of sense when our culture systemically treats male victims of rape the same way it treats those of domestic violence, the only exception being that barriers men face in seeking help run even deeper and aren't just ignored by the government but enforced. In 2015, the UK government answered a petition begging them to change the legal definition of rape, which to this day only describes a penis penetrating the victim's mouth, anus or vagina, rendering it legally impossible for a woman to rape a man, either by forced envelopment of his penis with their mouth, anus or vagina, or even with penetrative toys. Predictably, a nonsense excuse was given and nothing was done. For this reason, crime statistics on rape in the UK show a far lower proportion of males, which the study Perceptions of Male Rape and Sexual Assault in a UK Male Sample, Barriers to Reporting and the Impacts of Victimization has verified to only intensify the myth that men cannot be raped at all, especially by women, and so male victims of rape don't seek help and don't go to the police. But this goes beyond the government level. The same study not only says that of their questions, the only items generating higher agreement ratings were those suggesting that the police are unlikely to take male sexual victimization seriously, and where the offence in question was sexual assault or assault by penetration and the perpetrator female, that men should be able to defend themselves against such crimes. They also listed prevalent myths about rape, which often prevent males from reporting or taking reports seriously, including that real men can defend themselves against rape, that only gay men are victims or perpetrators of rape, that men are not affected by rape or not as affected as women are, that a woman cannot sexually assault a man, that a male rape only happens in prisons, that sexual assault by someone of the same sex causes homosexuality, that homosexual and bisexual individuals deserve to be sexually assaulted because they are immoral and deviant, that if a victim physically responds to an assault, then he must have wanted it. Most of these play into the gender roles of men needing to be strong and self-sufficient and incapable of feeling, but present also are gender roles which dictate that men are both heterosexual and hypersexual, to the point of constantly and indiscriminately longing for sex, which only feeds the myth that men are always the rapists and cannot possibly be the victims. I want to be quite unmistakable that this is rape culture. It is affecting men, and it's not just socially and institutionally promulgated. There is literally a law that my government has reflected on in recent years and approved of that makes our system completely, legally blind to the idea that a woman could ever commit a rape. Rape itself and rape culture are systemic issues for men as well as women. Now keep everything we've covered so far in mind, especially what we know about shelter provision for men, when I tell you that men compile between 84% and 86% of the homeless population. As for the gender of the hidden homeless, the sources are unsurprisingly hazy. It is also well documented that many homeless men have experienced sexual assault and struggle with substance abuse, which is unsurprising considering that the two are comorbid. Compound this with the fact that most housing for the male homeless requires that you be sober, and you might reveal exactly the state in which we leave male victims of sexual violence. Explorations of why men constitute so much of the homeless often state that women are more likely to be with children and therefore be given higher priority in provision of housing, and that generally men are just seen to be less vulnerable than women, and so the male homeless will always be of the lowest priority. This, of course, links back to single women being more likely to have children in the first place on account of decisions regarding child custody being biased in their favour. Rarely is it suggested so outright that women are more important than men solely by virtue of their sex, but such is the lot of homeless men, and while all of these things can be linked to a gender role for men which dictates that we must withstand unlimited suffering without ever complaining or expecting help, to my mind there is another influence at play. Whenever our society considers men as a group, be it fathers warning daughters or policymakers in government seats, the humanity of men gets overwritten by the caricature of man in the national consciousness. Men who aren't only unsympathetic but righteously contemptible for being nothing besides the epitome of their gender role. Emotionally dead, aside for their anger and unrestrained lust, and therefore the rapists are never the raped, abusers are never the abused, stubborn, single-minded and sexist, incapable of real love or of understanding women, unfit to be parents, and ultimately undeserving of our care. So morally, we find no wrong in abandoning men to rape, abuse, homelessness, and eventual suicide, because men constitute 75% of all UK suicides, and have done so ever since the 90s. And it is sad that I think many feminists are partially responsible for perpetuating this vision of man, because we failed as the equality movement not to simply make flimsy excuses as the one I'm currently addressing for not only bolstering society's abandonment of men, but damning them further by simplistically reframing the issues that harm all sexes as men being oppressors and women being the oppressed, reassuring the world that men alone could ever rape, and that women alone are the victims. The web that is gender oppressing the male sex extends as far as the eye can see. It is demonstrable fact that men too are institutionally and systemically oppressed, to the resounding agreement from the studies and data, publicly and freely available, every single one of them. So even if we do entertain that for sexism to be recognised it must be systemic, we still have a responsibility to help men as well as women. Should feminists help men? I'll finish this video by addressing one last contention so that we're out of excuses. It reeks of male privilege to believe that the feminist movement should drop everything so that men can steal the spotlight from women everywhere they go. Fortunately, knowing the extent to which men are also suffering rather takes care of the gesture towards privilege. As for stealing the spotlight, I can understand the worry, as would many MRAs who primarily concern themselves with anti-feminism. It is natural to get defensive about the struggle of a group to which you are juxtaposed, because it can feel accusatory or even belittling of your own experience to know that you enjoy certain privileges that they don't. But I believe that a trans and male inclusive feminist movement is better equipped than any other to both understand and dismantle the gender roles and systemic sexism that oppress people of all sexes by so rigidly dividing us against one another. Not only are trans rights and men's and women's liberation not mutually exclusive, but they also demand a universal struggle, a struggle that is grounded in mutual education on our plights and privileges, a valiant empathy for each other, and cooperation in activism, so that all of us can effectively as possible fight for each other and also for ourselves. And if you want to know specifically how that might work, I already made a video essay on the topic. But by all means, suggest that we should prevent spotlight stealing by segregating our equality movements by gender or sex, disposing each one of them to build upon theories which discount the other, all while inevitably competing with each other for attention, understanding, and funding. At least that way we can argue about who's more important, rather than ever fighting for the issues that we actually care about. Sarcasm aside, it is precisely this gender-based segregation without mutual understanding that motivates the likes of TERFs, terrified like you of losing or even compromising their womanhood and women's movement to an abhorrent caricature that they themselves painted of men. Moreover, trans people often have a unique experience with both male and female types of oppression, in addition to transphobia. So if we truly want to understand trans issues, we will inevitably require a holistic understanding of gender that is grounded in reality rather than assumptions about the other. If nothing else, consider that the feminist movement has already worked on men's issues, namely by way of the anti-rape movement, which caused the UK government to legally recognise that men can be raped by other men. The spotlight was not stolen from women then, and it would not be stolen now. Instead, we can work hard to much better understand each other and make a world where no child is subjugated by the genitals with which they are born. I sincerely hope that I have helped to foster some understanding with this video, because the issues faced by all genders matter immensely to me, and I honestly believe that a concentrated effort by the feminist movement to set them right would make the world a better place. So until next time, I've been the Mandy in your mandatory entertainment. If you have any thoughts or questions, do let me know in the comments. I'm happy to entertain, even if you'd like to exchange sources, or perhaps talk verbally for something longer and more streamlined. Please like the video if you think I did a good job, and have yourself a wonderful day. Farewell!